I don't want to hear about leaks. The Boston Celtics blew up the story. You could have fired him and said, ask him.
Welcome to the Dark Times channel. And I want to take a second to chime in to talk about what Stephen A. Smith had to say about the former Boston Celtics head coach, Ime Doke, who was formerly with the Boston Celtics, but he was let go or indefinitely suspended for allegedly having a workplace romance or a workplace relationship with a Boston Celtics employee. And when the story first broke a few months back towards the beginning of the NBA season, I did a video on this very subject, the same subject that Stephen A. Smith is going to be alluding to. The fact that the Boston Celtics didn't even fire Ime Doke. The fact that they left him hanging out to dry. There was no formal firing. It would have made much more sense, even from a business perspective, because at the end of the day, the Boston Celtics are a business. And businesses are in business of protecting their image at all cost, usually. Unless you're talking about a head coach who happens to be a so-called black man having an affair with a so-called white woman. Because at the end of the day, it's still Boston. And Ime Doka is still a so-called black man. And you know what? Udoka, he's a perfect example of why so-called black men, in particular, strong heterosexual so-called black men, have no place in the corporate world or in corporate offices. And they make sure that. And I'm not saying so-called black men shouldn't try to go out and get corporate positions or work in the corporate environment. You know, by all means, if somebody's willing to pay you what you think you're worth, and they're going to give you X amount of dollars to perform a specific task or duties, then by all means go for it. Get your money. But you should always go into it with both eyes open, being aware of microaggressions and macroaggressions that are going to be going on in the workplace. Because a seemingly strong black heterosexual male like Ime Doka, they're always going to be a threat to some extent. They're always going to be a threat to so-called white men. In particular, when they're in positions of authority. You know, it's already somewhat of an aphrodisiac to a woman when they see a strong masculine man in power, especially if it's a strong black heterosexual male. And so, of course, there was a racial element and racial undertones as to what happened to Ime Doka with the Boston Celtics. And Stephen A. Smith is going to be alluding to it. I'm going to go ahead and let the video play, and then, of course, I'll chime in.
I'm going to educate y'all about something. And yes, at the time, I took it to the racial component. And I'm going to take it there now. I know personally of an inordinate amount of stories that involved white men associated with sports franchises who were screwing around with someone internally. Let me tell you what I've never seen. I never saw a damn press conference about it. I never said Ime Udoka shouldn't be fired. I didn't have an opinion as to whether he should be fired or he should be kept. My opinion was keep him or fire him. What you don't do is publicize it.
And so, bingo, Stephen A. Smith hit the nail on the head. Either you keep him or you fire him. You don't dangle him out there to let people run wild with rumors and innuendos and him having to deal with alleged assault rumors and all kind of things like that. Because I remember when the story first broke, I remember y'all's girl, Malika Andrews. She was one of the first people to try to throw Ime under the bus. She was on ESPN trying to lump Ime Udoka in with predator-like behavior. She was on ESPN trying to suggest that Ime Udoka was some kind of predator and that he was preying on women with the Boston Celtics. She was one of the first people on ESPN of course, to no surprise. Like I said, I've done many videos on Malika Andrews at this point, so you all should know her get down by now.
Well, one thing, Zach, that you touched on was just this gross focus on identifying unnecessarily women's names that may or may not be involved. And I think it is it isn't too harsh to say that that was a failure by many people, including folks within our own industry. And
so what the Boston Celtics did with Ime Udoka was pretty much leave him out to dry. They knew exactly what they were doing when they held that press conference, and they were talking about protecting women and using that kind of dog whistling. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were sicking their dogs on Ime Udoka, and that's exactly what wound up happening.
He's the only one screwing? Nobody else was. Everybody else was celibate. They kept their stuff in their pants. They were the Pope. Only black dudes screwing around. We ain't hear nothing about any of those other folks. I've been covering sports for 30 years. I have never seen a press conference to address somebody's suspension, and everyone knew because of leaks that preceded the press conference, even though they didn't say much in the press conference, that it was about his sexual relationship. I can tell you what we also heard, and we don't know this definitively. That the woman was white. Her identity's protected. Fine, no problem. Can I ask all the ladies out there and all the men out there something? What about the sister, the black woman named Nia Long?
Shout out to Stephen A. Smith trying to shoot his shot at Nia Long. This is a much longer clip. I only played a snippet of it, but for about 5 or 10 minutes, Stephen A. Smith is going on and on about Nia Long and how talented she is and bringing up different movies and roles she's played in. So shout out to Stephen A. Smith trying to get in where he can fit in. And I'll say this about Stephen A. Smith. Stephen A. Smith has taken a lot of flack from the so-called black community for his cooning and buffoonery that he's done on ESPN, but it really doesn't bother me to the degree that it bothers a lot of other people, because I expect it. You're never going to get the black Tucker Carlson or the black Sean Hannity on primetime television or anything like that. You're never going to get that version. So there's always going to be a level of coonery, and there's always going to be a level of buffoonery that so-called black men and women have to perform on primetime television. So I'm not upset because I'm not shocked. And it doesn't surprise me that so-called black people have to do this in Hollywood. Either they do that or they wind up apologizing. Those are the only two options. But it seems like Stephen A. Smith is on his way out at ESPN. There's a lot of rumors circulating and percolating that Stephen A. Smith may be on his way out. And good for him. Hopefully he leaves on his own terms. But if he doesn't, good for him. I hope he's fired. Because Stephen A. Smith is way too talented to be limited to ESPN. I think there's a lot of good insight that Stephen A. Smith has to offer. And the sooner he leaves ESPN and starts to do his own thing, the better off he'll be, and the better off everybody else will be who listens to Stephen A. Smith. Because Stephen A. Smith definitely has some value to offer. But Stephen A. Smith did bring up another good point as it pertains to other athletes and coaches in that same situation, but never having to face the music, so to speak. Everything's always been swept under the rug, and you never heard any mention of it. I can remember a certain situation that happened back in the early 2000s. And a lot of y'all may remember this one too. If y'all remember the player Steve Nash, who played with the Phoenix Suns, then you also remember his teammate by the name of Jason Richardson. And this was one of the wildest stories that never got publicized. It was known in the NBA circles, and who knows how it would have played out in this day and age with social media and different outlets. But Steve Nash was married to an individual who was having his baby. I believe he was married to her. I could be wrong. But Steve Nash was in a relationship with a woman who was having his child. And Steve Nash is at the hospital, and his woman, his lady, his wife, or whatever the case may be, is about to give birth to his first child. And it's the age-old story, going back to slavery, I suppose. The baby comes out, and the baby does not look anything like the father. The baby is black.
I be the paw boss. I'm the paw that there youngin' boss. I'm the peppy.
Worst case scenario for Steve Nash. And so the baby's black, and the mother's got some explaining to do. And so I guess she winds up confessing and telling him that, it wasn't his child, of course, like he already knew. But who was the father? None other than slam dunk champion Jason Richardson, who was also one of my favorite players back in the day. He was a guy that his game revolved around having a lot of athleticism, and he was a high flyer. So he was a very exciting player to watch. And so Jason Richardson is said to be the father of Steve Nash's wife's child. There was no press conference. There was no mention of it whatsoever in the media. Within a couple of weeks, Jason Richardson is no longer with the Suns. He's traded. It was a peculiar move, to say the least, because at that time, I believe the Phoenix Suns were in first place in the West, and it was smooth sailing. Everything was going good. So it was a peculiar move. But, things happen. Trades happen all the time, and you never know. And no one is the wiser of what really went on behind the scenes. And so that was an example that came to mind when Stephen A. Smith was talking about that. Stephen A. Smith was talking about of having firsthand knowledge of players and coaches doing the exact same thing that Ime Udoka was found guilty of and was crucified of and was left out to dry by the Boston Celtics. And so we all know what time it was. Like I said, I did a video on this when it first went down, and to me it came across as a public buck breaking of Coach Ime Udoka. It was a warning shot to other executives. It was a warning shot to players. It was a warning shot to coaches, in particular so-called black coaches and players, that, hey, you can do what you want on your own time, and you can do what you want outside of these walls, whether it be in the NBA arena or whether it be in the offices. But when you're in these walls and you're in these offices, the white women are off limits. You keep your black hands to yourself. And so that's how it came across to me. And that's exactly what it was. And so, like I said, shout out to Stephen A. Smith for even bringing up the topic. Stephen A. Smith seems like he has a wide range of topics that he would be pretty knowledgeable on. So I hope he does wind up branching out on his own and doing his own thing. I think he'll be much more interesting and much more pleasant to listen to. And so I think that's going to be a wrap on this video. Please let me know how y'all feel in the comment section. I'm always looking forward to chiming in and going back and forth with some of y'all, but it's all love at the end of the day. So if you like the video, please hit the like button. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please do that as well. And as usual, peace and chaos.